Good afternoon, everybody. It's Dr. Davis. I'm not that sick anymore. I'm still coughing a little bit, so bear with me if I cough during this mini lecture. I hope you're having a wonderful Memorial Day with your families, loved ones, and friends. I'm at home doing a lecture, so clearly I haven't done anything quite yet. Let me get a little bit of that glare out of there. Okay, so in essence, this week we are finishing both the Race of the Power of an Illusion series and also the History of White People. I'm so excited that I had a chance to read this with you all. I've had it for years, since just after undergraduate, actually, and this was my first time really working through the book at a pace that made sense, and I didn't read like a chapter here and then put it down for 2 years. So thank you for that opportunity from me. And also, I hope that those of you who did read the book, it's kind of obvious you didn't because of some of the questions you choose, but I'm not judging you. You're doing the work, you're doing great. Um, but do read some of the texts because they will come in handy on your midterm and final. I promise that. And I'm writing them. Anyway, so this week's lecture is essentially a closing out of these ideas. We go into some of the developments of race science through the early part of the 20th century. It kind of dies after that because, as we read about last week, Franz Boas was like, nah, son, race science is kind of bogus. Let's look at cultural relativism. Ooh, that was a stutter. And also, let's think about the different ways to look at the experiences of different so-called races in this country based on their access to resources, opportunity, the circumstances of their environments, et cetera, et cetera. And he's followed by researchers like Ruth Fulton Benedict, um, who really undoes the whole kind of race categorization system, especially within white races or European races, by saying that, like these things, these physical characteristics do not and cannot determine one's intelligence, one's beauty. Like, beauty is subjective, or, you know, yeah, beauty is subjective for the most part, or objective. I don't know. In the eye of the beholder. My mind is escaping me right now. It's time for coffee. And also, intelligence depends on access. And she upsets a whole lot of folks by doing a study with a collaborator on the educational levels of black northern men and white southern men. And she finds that the black northern men often have a better grasp of information and literacy than the white southern men. And white people didn't want to read that, especially not in the 1930s. So it's really interesting what begins to undo the system of race science or racial hierarchies, especially when some of the policies written by the very people actively upholding and collaborating on these ideas they are actually uh, being discredited in court. Um, and one specific case that comes to mind is and I want to pronounce his name correctly, is the story of Bhagat Singh Thind in the 1940s. He serves in World War II. He becomes a naturalized citizen of the country because of his service. But there are restrictions to him, gaining access of some kind that is restricted to white people. And for the most part, I believe that his access, according to Race the Power of Illusion, deals more so with housing, deals more so with his access to the GI Bill. And according to Ripley's list of white races and Caucasian races, his ethnicity or his so-called race, being a Southeast Asian man, Indian, by today's definitions, was listed under Caucasian. So, the fact that they tried to throw out his case by saying that, like, whiteness is subjective and that science doesn't mean anything, and he even brought a race scientist with him to the courtroom. Um, is telling about like the flimsiness of these definitions of race and racism, and most specifically, whiteness as something that people later in the 20th century, like especially during like the Cold War era and after World War II, are able to literally buy their ways into whiteness. It becomes a matter of, not quite crawling one's way up a ladder to become white, but then more so to distinguish oneself from being a person of color, or more specifically black, as Painter points out, and the film points out for that matter, and distinguished from, those specific populations by space, by social economic class, by utilization of resources like education and parks. And it's really interesting how that develops and that continues to exist today, especially when we look at, continued redlining, continued school segregation, and continued social and political separations that have come to define American society. And I'm not saying these things to nitpick or anything. I'm saying these things to point them out to you as realities and things that endorse and support our understanding of what we're reading and what we're observing and what these authors and filmmakers are presenting to us. So it's really interesting to see what the author, Neil Irvin Painter, and also the filmmakers do with this idea of suburbia. The idea that building a physical space in which, people who call themselves white or who desire to call themselves white can be physically removed from populations who will never be able to call themselves white, historically, socially, physically, etc. In the 1950s. I'm not saying that of today, because more so it's a kind of a class barrier thing and a way of people saying, I have more so I can be here, as opposed to there. And even that's shifting as cities undergo changes that attract more upwardly mobile populations. But that's a conversation for a different sociology class. But with regard to like housing segregation, the building of suburbs, and just to add on to one of the points I left in the PowerPoint that you'll see, the construction of the interstate expressways and highways as a kind of decimation of these urban centers of, ethnic or diverse and ethnic communities, including not only Black Americans, but also Eastern Asian Americans, Southeast Asian Americans, Middle Eastern populations, European Jewish populations, Slavs, Irish, Polish, Hungarian, etc., and how many cities, but namely, let's talk about Detroit, how they allowed the federal government, for the most part, to carve up these communities in order to make direct pathways to the suburbs so that, and I'm having problems saying white people now because of what we've read, so that people who are white can, go to their jobs downtown, whether they're, for the motor companies or the newspapers, the department stores at the time, et cetera, and so forth, and immediately usher themselves out of town to their segregated communities that are devoid of people of color or devoid of undesirable ethnic groups in this country is a telling history. And I encourage you to look that up on your own if you care anything about urban planning or the history thereof. There's a lot to be said of the urban renewal projects in Detroit, which didn't turn out to be quite so much renewal as they were a devastation. Any drive down Farnsworth and up Shane, would be very telling. And to be clear, like I have acquaintance whose father owns a nightclub on I believe it's on Shane. And it's in the old Paradise Valley district. Look up Paradise Valley, which endorses and supports this story. And that area is devastated. And with the loss of the assembly plant over by I-94, they lost a large clientele. So super added to the point that they're in this kind of devastated looking wasteland area of the east side of Detroit. Their clientele has been impacted by the economic recessions that the city has faced for the last few decades. So there's so much more to the story of how race and racism began to shape our society and began to shape the ways that we not only interact with each other, but the ways that our government, our institutions interact with each of us. And this is not to pose a solution to the problem, but as we continue to read, and Painter leaves us on a note of opening up more conversations on systemic racism and the ways that it has specifically impacted African Americans and people of African descent in the United States. And so that's a good lead in to next week when we are moving on to Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, which is available through the Wayne State Library as an ebook online if you have not purchased it or been able to purchase it. So please look for that, and I'll try to find a link for it if you so desire. And with that said, I'm not going to take up too much of your time on a holiday with my little 12-minute video, but enjoy your day. Happy reading. Complete the discussion boards. Remember to work on your midterms. I gave it out early so it can be an incremental process and you don't find yourself during week 7 trying to read the class readings and a whole book and write a whole, assignment, at the last minute. So be kind to yourselves and give that a look-see as early as possible. But take care, and see you next week. Bye.